Welcome to the National Automobile Museum and our presentation about the Abernathy boys. I've named this back in 1910, when boys were men. A little table of contents here. First, we have a backstory to give you a little filler as far as the time and the family. Then I'll go through a few of the adventures that the boys had in their early lives. And then I'll wrap it up with what happened to them in their later lives. So to set the stage, think about the Oklahoma Territory. They're in Frederick, Oklahoma Territory, early 1900. The Abernathy family is made up of Jack and Jessie Pearl and their 6 children. Unfortunately, Jessie Pearl dies in 1907 from complications after delivering their 6th child, and that left the young family with a dad by the name of Jack. So let's find out what we can learn about Jack. Jack in the business was known as Jack Ketchum-Alive Abernathy. You see a photo here on the right-hand side of Jack with a dignitary visitor. You may recognize Teddy Roosevelt. So Jack's background is very interesting. He was a child prodigy, an accomplished musician, and according to the record, somewhere between the ages of 6 and 9, he started to play piano in saloons. Again, 1900s, not a lot of cash around, but young Jack was making upwards of $13 an hour playing piano in saloons. Mother didn't approve of this, as you could imagine, and he gave up that profession at an early age and became a cowboy at age 11. There's kind of a trend here you may want to remember as we go along, okay? So he was very successful at that, and by age 15, he was working at some of the biggest spreads in the Texas Panhandle in Oklahoma, and he was riding first saddle. That lasted for a period of time, and then he became, that's right, a piano salesman. Piano salesman activities worked for a period of time, and then he went off to become a wolf catcher. And that's what Jack is really known for, because of his name, Jack Ketchum-Alive. Jack was providing live wolves to displays and concessions back in the early days, and was recorded up to $50 for a sale of a live wolf. And I've read where in the period of his life he may have captured as many as 2,500 wolves alive and then sold them. This notoriety came all the way up to the Secret Service, who cued Teddy Roosevelt as to the activities of this great outdoorsman. And Teddy said, well, we should go down there and check this out. I think I need to do that. So Teddy Roosevelt and his entourage of Secret Service people went down to Frederick, Oklahoma, and Jack said, I'll catch as many wolves barehanded as you would like. And they didn't really understand the terminology then, but Jack had a methodology. He had an Arabian horse, he had greyhounds, and they would set upon wolves in their dens or whatever. They would chase the wolves to a point where they were ready to turn and fight. The greyhounds would set upon the wolves. Jack would leap from his Arabian, and his technique was to go to punch a wolf. And that was the barehanded catch, because, as Jack said, there's one thing you can rely upon, and that is the wolves never miss. And he would ram his fist into their throats and then bend their jaw down and then be able to tie him off or do whatever he needed to do. And as you see in the picture here, he's holding a live wolf with Teddy Roosevelt in attendance, and it's like, well, Mr. President, this is what, wolf number 5, should we go for a 6th? That type of a thing. Teddy was so impressed that they became lifelong friends, and he went to Jack and said, is there a federal job that you would like? Anything, just ask me. And Jack said, I like it down here. How about if I'm just the U.S. Marshal for Oklahoma Territories? and hence he got his title, and he did that job in a very splendid fashion. In a later life, he went on to become a wildcatter, and you'll see at the end of the presentation that all loops around again one more time. So our first adventure, now that we've done the background, is to introduce the boys and get off on the trail with them for the first time. So the two gents are Louis Van Abernathy, known as Bud to all, and at 9 years old, he pretty much declared himself the navigator for their exploits. And Temple Reeves Abernathy, known as Temp, was a 5-year-old and was a saddle partner, modest young man. The boys were avid readers, they were very intelligent, and they began to pester their father when they were doing their studies because they recognized that there was a new thing out there called the New Mexico territories, and that was of great curiosity to them. And then they read that the governor, who happened to know Jack Ketchum-Alive Abernathy, had just built a new mansion for the state of New Mexico's governor, and they said, "Dad, we really need to go see that." So after a few days of conversation, Dad said, "I've got the ranch to take care of. Why don't you boys go to New Mexico and go visit the governor and visit his new mansion?" We're not talking helicopter parents here, okay? So in 1909, the boys, after their school sessions, got on horseback, and Jack gave him his best horse, Sam Bass, and a small pony for Temp, and they took off alone. That means unaccompanied, for a journey of over 1,000 miles on saddleback to Roswell and then up to New Mexico. To Santa Fe, New Mexico. And you got to ask yourself, two young boys alone. You think of 5 and 9-year-olds. How bright are they at that point, right? Sent them out on the trail alone for, what, 2 weeks? So let's see how they did that. Again, the boys were pretty adept at all this type of work. They hand drew their own maps. Their father had the foresight to issue each boy a checking account and funded it with $100 cash so that the boys had some sense of responsibility for their activities and also for the ability to pay for emergency repairs, food, things like that. The two boys often referred to themselves as two tough cowpokes, and these kids really were. Sam Bass was the Arabian that Jack used for his wolf catching expeditions, and he gave that to Bud, and Geronimo was given to Temp, being a slighter young man, right? And one of the things I read that was interesting was that they could go through the wilderness for 24, 36 hours navigating by stars, following game trails, wagon trails, things like that. But if they were to come across a farmhouse or a ranch, they would just mosey on up and introduce themselves. And the parents that would be living there would say, "Well, why don't you come in, join us for lunch? Anything you boys need, shoe a horse," something like that. And that turned out to be a repeated pattern throughout all of their adventures, where they could go anywhere, do anything, and they were immediately accepted as just a 5 and a 9-year-old on the trail, you know, doing a 1,000-mile trip or something like that. To fill out their saddlebags, they also carried castor oil. I'll let you fill in the blank on that. And they also had their New Testament wrapped in a silk handkerchief. You got to realize this is pretty rough territory back then. You have cattle rustlers, you've got banditos, you've got all kinds of people out in the wild. And these boys are on their own. They don't have a game plan per se other than to follow the stars. Some of the things that they encountered were bad water. We don't think of that. You walk up to a water hole or something like that. Maybe it's muddy, maybe it's not. But there was gypsum water that would make you sick. There were other germs in the water, things like that we're not accustomed to. Or many times they would ride for several days with no water at all. There was unbearable summer heat. They went through sandstorms and hail. We always think of, well, you just go down the lonesome trail, right? Well, a lot of these trails were flooded. There were river washes and things like that, and they had wild water to cross and many obstacles. It's just like you couldn't come up to a bridge and cross over every time. There also obviously were wolves. There were lots of banditos, and they were told that the scorpions were as big as bananas. And I thought that was pretty good. But once again, farmhouses and hotels saved the day for when they happened to be exhausted, out of food, or tired. They were able to hook up with some people and get taken care of. So after 2 weeks on the trail, so think about that. So over 1,000 miles, 2 weeks, maybe 21 days. They're probably doing 50 miles a day, day after day in the saddle. They finally met up with Governor George Curry. And again, one of these interlocking stories, he was a former Rough Rider that worked with Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba. And after a grand celebration and dinners and taking care of the boys for a short period of time, Curry wrote to Jack, "Hey, your kids are okay. They're here. They're fat as pigs now. Come and get them," right? Which I guess is the all's clear sign for people in that period, right? But even the return trip was very eventful. They were shadowed by cattle rustlers, and they had numerous near misses and bad weather and obstacles like that to go through. So this first trip really anchored their confidence and their skill and gave them their road manners, if you will, on how to travel day after day alone on horseback. Second adventure, talking Frederick, Oklahoma to New York City. Now, why would two schoolboys in Oklahoma want to go to New York City? Well, again, Teddy Roosevelt was keeping up with the boys and the family, and he wrote to him and said, you know, I'm in Africa on my hunt after my presidential period, but I'll be returning to New York City, and I'd like you boys to be in my parade down Fifth Avenue. So Jack said, I've got a ranch to take care of. Why don't you boys go up to New York and get ready for the parade? So the boys took off on their own again. This time, of course, they were much more experienced. They were going not from a territory to a territory in the wilderness, but up through the central United States and across into a lot more civilized areas. So the other thing that made it very interesting was that the adventure of these boys was noted by the press, and they became an item. And over a short period of time, Bud and Temp became household names, and people were like, do you think they're coming through town today? We need to go into town and see what's going on. Very interesting picture here. I'll refer to it in a little bit, if I remember. And maybe somebody will give me a hand there, wink, wink. Okay. They had lots of fame and lots of drama on the trail going up through the United States on the way to New York. First off, Geronimo, the pony, foundered from heat exhaustion, so they had to leave Geronimo with a stable, and the stable operator said, it's not a problem, I'll just put him on a train when the horse feels better, and I'll send him back to your dad. Take one of my horses, will you? Such was their notoriety. There were young people and old people alike that took advantage of the boys. When Geronimo foundered, the stable owner said, I've got a horse for here. I know you boys have to get back on the road. That horse is $85. This is 1910 period, so that's a few bucks, right? As they headed north, they went through sleet and snow, but the highlight of the trip at that point was St. Louis, where they saw their first automobiles in use, in numbers, and the boys were absolutely enamored. So on the trail, the fame preceded the boys. They were treated like VIPs in the various cities such as St. Louis, Cincinnati, Dayton, Washington, D.C., etc. They got to meet President Taft. They were deputized as sheriffs in Dayton, Ohio. They got to visit the Wright brothers airplane factory. And if you think back in time, This is an evening when the boys were rustled out of their beds in a hotel by the hotel owner and taken to the window, and he said, "Look out there. If you live for another 75 years, you may see Halley's Comet one more time." And that was very notable. I did a reference to the previous slide, and let me go back to that. There's an interesting point here. If we look right here on the picture, there's an object in Temps Hand. And when the boys were in Dayton, Ohio, they were deputized by the sheriff, and he said, now that you're deputies and you have your badges, we'll give you nightsticks, and you can only use them for the purpose of justice and restoring law. That turned out to be quite fortuitous, because on the trip, one evening, very late, the boys showed up at a stable, and a young boy there jumped young Temp, who was like 5, 6 years old, right? And he was pulling him down off of his horse with the intention of fighting with him and then stealing the horse, saddlebags and blankets and everything else. Well, Temp reached for his nightstick, whacked the kid over the head, and dropped him in place. And that wasn't the only time that Temple used his nightstick. But on the upside, they had lots of escorted tours. They were greeted at the edge of town by motorcyclists and brought to the best hotels and things like that, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, visiting the Wright brothers airplane factory and seeing Halley's Comet. The boys made it to New York City, and there's a lot of information that's kind of difficult to dig out, but the boys were there early enough where they went to Coney Island. And you go, for the attractions, for a Ferris wheel? No. Back in that period, Coney Island was the Hollywood. And that's where movies were being made. And the boys suddenly were thrust into roles in movies, and just like their dad, were able to hustle a few dollars and get a little more notoriety. There was the Abernathy boys to the rescue. Then there was Rescue the Abernathy Boys in various skits that they did as movies, and they produced some income for themselves. The parade came, and there are several pictures and a little bit of video now on the internet, and you can actually see pictures of Teddy Roosevelt in his coach, and directly behind them were the two boys riding their horses, and behind them were the Rough Rider veterans following Teddy and his entourage up Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue plays well into this story as well. They got to see lots of cars in use, and they were pretty excited about that, so they went to their dad, who had made it to New York by train, and said, "We need to get a car." And the dad, as always, tested their fortitude and said, "You need to go find a car that's small enough and is practical and something that you boys can actually operate and repair on your own." And the boys went up and down Fifth Avenue. They talked to all of the car dealerships, and they came back with the realization that cars were big, expensive, and very complex. They were pretty forlorn at that point, and they looked out the window and they saw a small car go by, and a young man was driving it. So they sprinted out and followed him. They met him and they said, "Well, what is this all about? Can you actually operate this?" And he says, "Yeah, I just drove it here." He says, "Why don't you boys get in and I'll show you where I bought my brush." And the boys went to the dealership, and they were coached on all of the different systems. They were taught how to drive rudimentarily, and they were allowed to take a 30-minute test drive with one of the people from the brush dealership. And they came back to their dad and exclaimed, "Dad, we didn't hit a single person." And the salesman had told us, anyone who can turn a coffee mill can run one of these machines. So for $485, a brush was purchased, and the boys got their brief road experience in New York City, and then they took off for Oklahoma. Then they had to make their return trip. So we have the Manhattan to Oklahoma territory. if you root through the details, you find out that the boys didn't go directly to Oklahoma, but they went from Coney Island in Manhattan all the way across to Detroit, where they appeared in automobile shows with the brush factory people. So there was a very tight alliance or relationship between Brush and the young men. There was a little booklet written about it as far as the Abernathy boys going across country. They appeared in many ads, so they became collateral for Brush, and that relationship is pretty well documented. While in Manhattan, though, Jack, being the adult, couldn't go home in a Brush, so he chose a Maxwell 30 horsepower, but he couldn't operate it, so he had to get a chauffeur. And if you read the fine print, somewhere between New York City and Detroit, the car caught fire and they abandoned, and they shipped the car home, and Jack took the train home as well. And one of the fine reports that I liked out of my readings was Bud, where he said, Temps said, "Bud gave me a turn at the wheel every so often, but reaching the pedals was a chore." So again, close your eyes and imagine no roads, wilderness, these two kids bumping along at 20, 25 miles an hour, day after day, heading back to Oklahoma. It took them 23 days and they covered 2,500 miles. How about, did you hear the one about the elephant and the donkey? That's right. This was another adventure. So by now you can kind of figure out that Jack is working the system pretty well. He has a lot of contacts in New York City, he has a lot of contacts in politics. He knows a lot of people who are business people that are looking for adventure, or they're willing to sponsor events, stuff like that. So the boys were called back to New York, and they were to be in a race from Coney Island to Philadelphia. And the mounts this time, instead of horses, would be Judy, the 7,000-pound elephant, and Jenny, the donkey. And if you can get the symbolism there, you can begin to figure out what's going on. This was a promotion to figure out who would win the 1912 presidential election. And it makes perfectly good sense, doesn't it? Right? So anyway, the rest of the story is that over 4 days, the donkey ran away several times. The elephant had considerable problems with its pads on its feet because it's out on street and it's summertime and it's hot. The story winds up with the donkey being rather disgruntled, but not as much as the elephant. So the handler for the elephant calls for timeout, takes the elephant to a side field, and begins to hose down the elephant, who is experiencing tremendous heat and humidity and is drinking copious amounts of water. And people start gathering around an elephant because this is not a typical Thursday in anybody's life. And the elephant handler says, "Step back, please." The elephant doesn't want to be crowded. And with this, one person says, "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not afraid of elephants," and steps to the elephant. Pause for about 2 seconds. The elephant grabs the person with its trunk and hurls the person in excess of 20 feet through the air. That pretty much brought an end to the contest as to who was going to win the election in 1912. Again, with promoters and some other activity behind the scenes by the dad, the promoters come across and they say, "Bring the boys back to New York. We have another game. How about if the boys go cross-country solo in under 60 days, or in 60 days or less? They cannot eat or sleep indoors. They have to rough it the whole way unaccompanied." And the father says, "We'll do that, but I've got a rule. The boys don't ride on Sunday." The trip turns out to be very difficult, very arduous. Again, they're clipping along at more than 50 miles an hour, and Sam Bass, their prized horse, gets into an alfalfa field and starts munching down on green alfalfa. Sam Bass founders and passes They have to buy another horse. They continue on. Those two horses don't work as well as the first pair of horses. And as a result, there's a little conflict there, but that's just more drama on the road. The big story, though, is crossing the Great Salt Lake. They're halfway across the Great Salt Lake, and the boys bed down for the night. They've got their saddles, their saddlebags, and their blankets, and Bud neglects to tether the horses or to hobble the horses so that they don't roam away. They wake up the next morning, the horses are gone. They're in the Great Salt Lake desert area. They have less than a half a canteen of water. They have 2 or 3 cans of food. And they spend the next 3 days roaming in a daisy chain out from their locale, trying to find the horses. And at the end of the 3rd day, when Temp is on his hands and knees praying to God for a death, Bud comes back with Temp's horse. They saddle up, they find a ghost town, and in the ghost town, of course, is Bud's horse. The horse is pretty smart. Now, a little side story quickly. They were left with just a couple of cans of food, and they had experienced multiple days in 110 degree plus heat, and they opened up a can of peaches and a can of tomatoes. Bud ate the peaches, Temp ate the tomatoes, and within a number of hours he had salmonella or botulism or food poisoning as we would know it. So that cost him another 2 days when Temp realized that he wasn't going to die in the middle of the desert. He was going to die in a desert ghost town of food poisoning. They overcame that after a few days. They got into Donner Pass. By now they're in sleet and snow. They completed 4,500 miles in 62 days. The previous record for horseback across country was 182 days. So a remarkable accomplishment, but only a record, not the trophy, not the $10,000. So you think by now, you think they're getting tempered, they might give this up? You're a little ahead of me though. 1913, the boys become enamored with flight because of the visit to the Wright factory, and they're also now enamored with motorcycles. So somehow they cut a deal with the Indian Motorcycle Company, and Indian delivers 2 motorcycles to the boys at their ranch in Oklahoma. Now, you got to realize, nobody in Oklahoma had a motorcycle at this time. Nobody's assembled one, nobody's ridden one, nobody actually possesses one. So over the next few days, they uncrate the bikes, they build them, they figure out how to fuel them, oil them, start them. And now we're joined by Anton, who appears in none of the documents up until this very point. Anton is a stepbrother. He's a little bit older than the other 2 boys, which is why they have 2 motorcycles. One is rigged with a operator's saddle and a pillion saddle, or a back saddle to it, and the other one is a solo bike. So after 14 miles of practice, the boys declare themselves ready to go, and they hit the road, heading in a northeasterly direction as it's reported. Oops, we skipped one. So some of the things that the boys went through in 1913 on their motorcycle. Washed out bridges were very common. There was one incident where Anton didn't want to ford a rushing stream with his motorcycle, so he finds a 2-plank pedestrian passage bridge, and he gets the motorcycle on there, and he's riding across, and halfway across it's like, hey, look at me, and rides right off the bridge, falls 25 feet into the creek. There was another adventure where the boys were upward of 65 miles an hour, and one of these newfangled things, a graded and oiled tar road, was in front of them. Dropped the bike, disaster, etc. Another time they were going past a farm, and a disgruntled farmer had dug a deep trench right across the road because he was tired of cars speeding through his property and scaring off all of his chickens. The boys hit it. They flew through the air. Temp almost wound up being lodged in a tree. He flew so far and so high. And the bikes were pretty well damaged, but the boys were able to piece things together as you do on the trail, and they kept going, right? On the way, they were able to stop at the Indianapolis Speedway, which was quite the deal back in that period, and they were allowed to take 3 laps at full chat, the 2 of them upright on their bike riding tandem, before they were escorted off the property. This is the end of the big long tail here. This is the part I call they lived happily ever after. So now Bud is 13 and Temp is 9, and they've had quite a few adventures. They've been written up extensively in the papers, and as we look through the history, we know that Roosevelt was not reelected. Jack, having sold enough wolves in his lifetime, decided to go into this thing called oil exploration and production. He became a wildcatter. Amazingly, the boys, sensing activity from World War I, enlisted in a military academy and got their more formal education in a military academy. From there, Bud went to the University of Oklahoma Law School. He graduated and was a practicing attorney in Wichita Falls. And Temp, being a good son, followed his dad into the wildcatting as an oil man. So I need to say now, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the National Automobile Museum, the Harrah Collection. And please remember to visit the museum and also to visit the brush roadster that is in Gallery 1, just like the boys used. And my closing statement is, the next time you want to get in touch with your inner child, you might think it best to think it through first. Thank you.